there's a lot we know and a lot we don't know about evolution. What's really served our society is our ability to nurture each other, but we don't talk about that, right? So I actually write about this in the resilience myth, which is the man the hunter myth. It's very clear now that many women were hunting, and not just hunting, but that women's bodies are built for endurance. And so it's causing a complete reevaluation of theories of hunting, gathering, history, evolution, which is totally fascinating, right? But we think a lot about the strength required to defend civilizations, to defend villages, to fight wars, to protect the homestead, and yet we don't value enough the what we think of as the feminine aspects of the world and world building, which are the caring, the nurturing, the connection, the inter-community interactions, which sometimes get represented as marriage exchanges,
Mm.
particularly in patrilineal, patriarchal sort of the take the wife, take the girl, send her to another place, keep the boys, like all of these theories, they're constantly changing.
Mm.
And they're just imbued with whatever our beliefs and values are now,
Mm.
because we don't know, right?
Take a step back. How do we misunderstand the word resilience?
So I think that, first of all, the word resilience has come to mean so many things in so many sectors that it almost doesn't mean anything anymore. It's so contextual, right? And so the way most people think about it in their lives is as an individual trait, a mental ability, a skill that they can develop. We've been taught that we can develop our resilience muscles and that we can learn to adapt better to life's adversities and hardships. And there are ways to do that, 10 ways to be more resilient, 5 ways to teach your children. And in that framework, though, and we make the assumption that we are freestanding, self contained individuals who should be self sufficient, strong, mentally tough, optimistic, productive. Like there's this whole list of things that goes into our ideals. But that's not about resilience. That is literally about our cultural ideals. If you try and focus on what helps us adapt, the fact is the vast majority of us are resilient. Human beings are incredibly resilient. And so I kind of turn that on its head and say, well, what if we asked instead, what do we do as a society to make it impossible for people to be resilient? Right?
Mm.
How do we get in the way of our resilience? Because in fact, what makes us resilient is belonging, meaning, nurture, connection, community, mutual support, societal recognition, cultural capital, all of these things that are outside of us that are relational.
Mhm.
And we just overemphasize the toxically individualistic, toxically masculine, toxically positive, to our detriment.
Soraya Chemaly is the author of The Resilience Myth New Thinking on Grit, Strength, and Growth After Trauma. A Bahamian American author, activist, and feminist, she's written as a freelance journalist for The Atlantic, Time Magazine, The Guardian, Huffington Post, and Ms. Magazine, among others, on topics ranging from freedom of expression to women's rights to media and technology. Among other things, she's been named one of Elle Magazine's 25 most inspiring women to follow on Twitter. To date, she is best known as the author of Rage Becomes Her, which was the topic of a prior episode of the Release podcast. In her new book, The Resilience Myth, Shamali has delivered a powerful manifesto for communal resilience based on in depth investigations into history, social science, and psychology. We are often urged to rely on ourselves for strength, mental fortitude and positivity. But Shamali challenges us to adapt our thinking about how we survive in a world of sustained overlapping crises. We will need each other now to embody true resilience, not more than ever. We are often urged to rely on ourselves for strength, mental fortitude, and positivity, but Shamali challenges us to adapt our thinking about how we survive in a world of sustained overlapping crises. We will need each other now to embody true resilience, not more than ever. We will need each other now just like we always have, and she's hoping we can finally admit it. The toxic individualism is the thing that got to me because
Hmm.
we tell ourselves it's a capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, but in fact, resilience is the ability um, to marshal all the resources and tap into all
Right,
the support that you need.
right.
Why do we believe resilience requires solitude in order to count?
So I think that our entire society is built around this idea of individual selfhood, particularly individual selfhood in relation to the state. And that idea is really that you should be an able bodied, free, self sufficient man capable of working, providing for yourself and your family, and pursuing your limitless dreams. And that's the universal idealized citizen. But
Mm,
in reality, uh, the ability to be any of those things sits on top of a system that provides free care in the shape of women, that provides um, access to work and money in the shape of racialized and gendered economic and social life. There are all these assumptions baked into this, and so even if you take today's chore wars and the debate over who's doing the unpaid work, who's not sleeping as much, who's taking care of children, that whole debate is a debate about entitlement to time, and it's also a debate about how we think of dependence. So people think of a woman who's a homemaker as dependent on her spouse because he makes money, which
right.
makes him self-sufficient and her dependent.
Mm,
But we don't think of him as dependent on her for food, healthcare, childcare, domestic life. Like that just is
social
made
life.
invisible. Social life, hermeneutic labor, that's just rendered completely invisible in this equation of resilience because the goal is to stand on your own 2 feet.
Mm.
Right? Another ableist assumption, if you think of the language, because all of us are dependent at some point. We're dependent as children. We're dependent when we're sick. We're dependent sometimes if we are pregnant. We're dependent in old age.
And I think it's important to make the point you're saying the archetype that we have of resilience is wrong because the archetype is this
Hmm.
idea of a man with a gun and a beaver pelt. I don't know,
Out
whatever,
in the
whatever.
wilderness,
And
being
he's like running
strong.
through the tundra and he's like
Hmm.
gonna keep going and going and going, and that's resilience. But
Hmm.
who's funded that trip?
Yeah,
Who's
who's
taking
fun?
care of the children at home?
Right,
Who got him there to begin with, right?
right. Who
In
told him he
fact,
had
that
this
type of
potential?
resilience has never existed. I think it existed once. There was a caveman, he was
Mm.
alone, he survived. But since then, that archetype has literally never happened in the way that we imagine it.
Yeah, I mean, there are those outlier. I love survival stories, so I'm constantly reading them.
Yeah.
But even then, I think, okay, here's an extraordinary person who's done this extraordinary thing. And that's part of our myth too, right? We have all of these narratives of extraordinary people who do extraordinary things and they quote unquote overcome the bad event.
Yeah.
But in fact, ordinary people living in chronically terrible circumstances persevere every day.
Mhm.
It's not even the fact of one event that has happened to them. It is the course of their lives. It is the history that they've inherited that makes for obstacles and challenges and traumas.
Mhm.
And our resilience myths also erase that. They erase history, context, relationships, power, resources. In the Horatio Alger belief that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
And this idea, you know, this idea that we have to do it alone. We are
Yeah.
poisoning ourselves with this idea that we have to do it alone because it's feeding into all genders, but in
Mm,
particular for women, motherhood, "Oh, I have to do it alone. I have to do this. I shouldn't ask for help."
mm.
there is a loneliness epidemic that is increasing from all angles. One
Yes.
of them is obviously the fracturing of the extended family, and one of them is people getting older and having second lives and thinking that they
Hmm.
can sort of divorce themselves from where they came from and all that kind of stuff, outside of obviously toxic situations where they have to. But this idea that people are taking pride in being on their own, right?
Right.
Um, and there's this loneliness epidemic where they're saying the rates of people who are dying in America and their bodies are going unclaimed
Mm.
is rising at an alarming
Oh, it's
rate.
terrible. It's really, and it's interesting. Globally, loneliness is a plague,
Mm,
particularly like in places like England and the US among young men, we're told, because young men are particularly lonely. And I delve into that a lot in the book. But in fact, the loneliest people on record right now are mothers of infants,
mm,
because it's really isolating, it's exhausting, it's a shock to the system. You do feel that you have to just do this, that you have to mother alone, because that's
mm,
how our society, it's just privatized mothering. It's insulated us in our, units of housing. And yet it's the least resilient thing is to be alone, and what I try and convey in the book, what I say is that we tend to learn in this mythology that the opposite of resilience is weakness or fragility.
mm,
It's a lack of toughness. Um, but the opposite of resilience is really loneliness.
mm.
And if you can think about the change from one paradigm to the other, then you can really understand what the myths represent and why we need to stop believing them.
That's going to stay with me because, Elie Wiesel famously said the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And you're
Mm,
saying the opposite of resilience is not weakness, it's loneliness.
hmm.
That right there can encapsulate everything that's happening in this generation, right?
Yeah.
And I really don't know where it ends up because there are so many people now who are divorced or never married or whatever it is, and they're single in their 40s,
Hmm.
50s, 60s,
Hmm.
and they're telling themselves they're all right, but they're not. And I don't love the idea that they're not admitting it because I think the need for community is a beautiful thing to express,
Hmm.
the hunger for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue is that we need to find secular community. We haven't replaced religious communities and religious life and everything that comes with that with healthy secular alternatives, third spaces, places for people to gather, to care for each other, to provide that kind of sustaining sense of belonging and meaning. And, if there were one place I would think to invest our collective energies, that would be it. It would be, how do we rebuild social fabric in ways that don't include oppressive heteropatriarchal power, right?
Mhm,
And right now you can see that also being fought in Gen Z. Young men are really turning towards religion and religiosity, particularly Catholicism, Christian evangelicalism, and young women are leaving in droves
mm,
because they explicitly understand that patriarchal religions in particular in this country, right? Like, because we're dominated by Judeo-Christian religions and Mormonism, they treat men and women unequally. Um, and that doesn't bother the men, which
mm.
is the source of great concern, like should
Right, the
concern
fact that
everybody.
it's not bothering them, this sort of deliberate, willful ignorance to the experience of others is a
Right.
huge part of the problem overall, and, you know, one of the things there's so many different notes that I had here. One is the infinite elasticity of women.
Hmm.
Um, but before we get to that, you talk a little bit about one of the markers of resilience,
Hmm.
unfortunately being unfounded optimism. And you talk about the
Yeah.
reasons why some groups have good reason to be optimistic, but not
Hmm.
necessarily to lay total claim to it. And I think, and that's an important point to make. I've always sort of grown up knowing I was extremely blessed to have such a massive family support network, but
Hmm.
also a lot of privilege in a lot of different ways,
Hmm.
be it financial, be it educational, but more than anything, just a large supportive family
Yeah.
is kind of everything, because knowing they'll catch you when you fall.
Hmm.
With every passing year in my life becomes clearer how few people
Have
really
that.
have that. Um, but you talk about unfounded optimism, and it brings to mind the natural disasters and the
Hmm.
ways that different cities will compete to
For,
insist that even in the midst of, I mean, the tragedy is not even over, right?
oh,
From the
100%.
shooting in Uvalde to a natural disaster, literally, they have not yet counted bodies. They have not
Mm.
yet figured out the full impact of the storm damage, and every city will immediately start insisting they're going to come back stronger. How do
Yeah.
you know? How do you know?
Well,
And
and
why is it a
yeah.
competition? Why are we chest thumping to say I have so, I mean, literally my town is floating away and
Mm.
my hair is on fire, but we're going to come back stronger. Take that, Toledo. What?
Right.
Why? Why?
Well, I mean, I think we're really going to have challenges because there's no doubt that with climate change, mass migration will happen. Entire communities are going to have to leave their historic homes
Mhm.
and find new ones. And at some point, that needs to be seen as the most resilient step, as opposed to rootedness, right? As opposed to that idea of strength in which you don't give up. Sometimes knowing, like what I say really is forbearing. Knowing when to stop is incredibly good. Having the cognitive flexibility to reimagine yourself in, in relation to a new place, in relation to different people, is essential to adapting. And I think one of the issues is in our resilience myths, we have this image that something happens, life changes, and we adapt.
Mm,
But in fact, what's happening is we are changing.
mm.
It's not external to us. We change when these things happen. And having the cognitive flexibility to think, what does it mean that I've changed, that I am changing, that my relationships are changing,
Mm.
is really essential to adapting. It sometimes happens
Instead
in,
of
yeah,
saying, I'm going to double down on who I was before and I'm
yeah,
going to
I'm
pick
going to
up
be
more
like
of
I
me.
was.
Right,
Yeah,
right. As if
you
that's
know,
the win. And that's really not the win.
that's not the win. It may be the loss. Like you can grieve yourself, you can grieve the person you were, the time that you long for, which is what migrants have to do all the time. I write a lot about ambiguous loss when
Hmm.
you're not even sure what it is you're grieving, right?
But you're grieving it.
But you're
Yeah.
grieving it, and we don't have a language or a facility with that idea because again grieving, I experienced this and I wrote about it. I had this really narrow concept of grieving for the longest time, which is that somebody dies and then you grieve.
Mm.
Very narrow, specific, tangible. But we grieve all the time. We grieve for our younger selves. We grieve for people we've lost in other ways. We grieve
Cultural
for, yeah,
grievance.
we grieve. We're grieving the climate. We're grieving the environment. We're grieving our own stupidity as a species. Like there's really, no end to that. And yet we don't really talk about it in constructive ways. So which is why
And
I
is it any
I
wonder
wanted
we're so
to.
lonely?
I know, right?
It's a buffet of grieving. It's a buffet.
Yeah. Yeah. And somehow, you're supposed to get over that grieving quickly. Move right through it. Be
Well,
productive,
and
be
that's the other quote.
optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah, the other quote in your book, because I wrote down so many of them,
Mm-hmm.
was you talk about dangerous resilience, right? And really, dangerous resilience is ignoring our feelings to dominate
Mm-hmm.
our environment.
Mm-hmm.
It just gives me this image of a woman who's like bruised and battered, and something horrific has happened,
Mm-hmm.
and she's telling herself she can still walk,
Mm. And that
and
she
she's
has to.
because she has to. And she's not going
Mm-hmm.
to ask anybody to help her. She's not
Yeah.
even going to say, "Can I lean on you?"
Mm-hmm.
She's going to say, "This makes me imagine the woman I'm going to be, because I'm going to be so much stronger when I drag my two legs that don't work with my teeth along the ground to get to wherever it is I need to be so I can fix my hair and help someone else or something." Describe to me the concept of women as an infinite resource.
So I think a lot of what we're taught in our society, again, it goes back to the first conversation we had, which was what are the underlying support systems for this notion of self-sufficiency, right? Um, and one of the underlying assumptions is that through the goodness of our hearts, women will just give and give and give, and be self-abnegating. They'll be infinitely flexible, infinitely absorptive. And we saw that with COVID, right? Where generally
Mm.
speaking, it was the women in society, whether they were healthcare workers or mothers or whatever, support roles they played, that they would just continue to absorb and absorb and absorb. And so we didn't really talk about what women need to be resilient, i.e., healthcare, societal investments in care, um, parental leave, insurance, whatever it may be. We don't talk about that. We just talk about what other people need to be resilient,
Mhm.
with the assumption that women are resilience resources for those people. So teachers are a good example, right? Teachers and healthcare workers. There are all these resilience programs that are like, you can be resilient, you can be resilient, which is all mindset based. How do you meditate? How are you grateful? Do you keep a journal? What can you do? Do you have some friends that you can hang out with now and then?
Here's
That's
more homework.
actually, but that doesn't actually help people be resilient. What they need is money.
Yeah.
What they need is better classrooms. What they need is safer streets. What they need are healthier communities. And yet, as teachers, largely a profession of women,
Mm.
we assume that they will be resources for children, for families, for communities, instead of then saying, okay, but what do they need to do that? You know,
This
t-
concept of the infinite elasticity of women really was
mm,
on display in the pandemic.
yeah.
And I love that phrase, the infinite elasticity. And you talk about that cartoon where
Oh,
the
so
woman just
funny.
never
The
stopped stretching.
Incredibles. Yeah.
The Incredibles, right, where the
Yeah.
woman never stopped stretching and
That
something
was her
else stepped up
superpower.
cartoon.
She could be
It's her
infinitely
superpower.
stretched.
Right, but then in the pandemic, the reality was that women were the caretakers, and if there weren't enough social services, then you had young children and you had ailing parents, and guess who was going to do it? So
And
the
work in the
infinite
closet.
last, right, and that is what we have built our concept of resilience on the back
Hmm.
of. And then women sometimes tell themselves that's not what they're doing. We all told ourselves, "Oh, the pandemic lockdown will be over in a minute." It wasn't a hot minute. Um, we tell ourselves we have grit. What's the
Mm.
difference between resilience and grit?
I mean, they're used interchangeably, like resilience and hardiness, right? And I think grit is great, but again, it has limits, and we should recognize those limits. It's very important to know when to stop and to value what stopping can mean. I recently wrote a piece for Business Insider. It was an excerpt from the book about children and sports, because one of the major ways in which children are being taught about resilience is through sports. It's a quality, an athletic quality, that you
Mhm.
don't give up and you fight on, and you have
You
that
walk it off.
grit. You walk it
Mhm.
off. You play through the pain. These are things that are still happening, right? And yet we don't value how hard it is for a kid to say, I think I'm going to stop playing this sport, for example, you
Mhm.
know, and people respond to that with, don't be a quitter, don't give up, keep going, even if it's hard. And yet for a child to get to that point, they're probably being contemplative. They're thinking, what is it that I want? What am I good at? What brings me joy? What else do
Mm.
I want to do with my time, with my life? What relationships do I want? What's the nature of the relationships that I want? And so it's not just a matter of being lazy, right? It's a matter of thinking, okay, what do we want the life skills of this person to be? Do we want them to just keep doing something that deprives them of energy, fun, pleasure, healthy relationships, or do we want them to think about those things?
A lot of the people who I interview on the podcast, it's so much fun because I get to do all this research for my children, right?
Yeah,
Besides
that's
the
right.
fact that you're feeding my brain, so thank you for that because you did it twice with both of these
Oh,
books, which has
thank
never
you.
happened before, and I love these concepts. Besides that, I get to do research for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And, I spoke with an expert on narcissism and I'm asking
Mm,
him, how can I narcissist proof my children?
mm,
And I'm talking to someone who wrote this book on healthy masculinity and I'm thinking, what is the thing your mom could have told you? That
Yeah.
might have made a little bit of a difference. By the way, we both cried on that podcast. It was so much
Mm.
fun. So to you, I want to ask, how do we teach our kids to distinguish between the self-harming perseverance and the healthy perseverance? Like, when does teaching our kids to persevere
Hmm.
cross the line into teaching them that we must endure solitary pain to consider ourselves resilient?
It's so hard.
But you're a
You
mom,
know, I am a mom, and that's why I'm saying it's so hard. I mean, my kids are now in their 20s, and
so you're
it's hard.
done.
It's hard, you would think. But I think, first of all, I think we say things, but then we do other things.
Mm,
The kids are
true
watching
story.
us all the
True story.
time, right? So I think modeling behavior is very important. Thinking for ourselves, because for me, adulthood has been a process of unlearning to relearn, unlearning to relearn, right? I had to unlearn so much and then be very conscious about what I wanted to learn, which you can't do as a child, right? And
Mm,
so I
yeah.
think for these kids, especially, one of the plagues that they're dealing with that is implicated in this model of resilience is perfectionism. We're seeing skyrocketing rates of debilitating perfectionism in kids because they feel like they have to keep striving, they have to keep trying, they have to keep growing. And if they can't accomplish, then there's something wrong with them, right? Like there's a lot of pressure put on kids, particularly if they're kids in a kind of intense academic environments or families that really value that, or athletic environments, right, where you just keep going and keep going. So I think it's a real mix of the language you use, the behavior you model, and also I think it's important to give children opportunities to fail and learn, because then I think they can be more conscious about making choices that are thoughtful as opposed to just doing the next thing on the track, the next thing someone else is telling them to do.
Well, this is inappropriately gendered, but I
Hmm.
had a boy first and then I had a girl. And the minute I had a girl, I knew that I was going to start saying things like, there's no such thing as perfect. Perfect is a dirty word.
Mm.
So I like say it all the time. There's just no
Hmm.
such thing as perfect. Perfect is a dirty word.
Hmm.
She will come into the bathroom when I'm like stepping out of the shower
Hmm.
and she'll say, I can see your butt, and she's,
Yeah.
how little girls are, right? And immediately my first instinct was, yeah, I have a butt. You have a butt too.
You have a
Everybody
butt
has a butt.
too.
And then I look in the mirror and I always say this if she sees me looking at myself in the mirror, I always say something along the lines of, I just love my body. It takes such good
It's so
care of me.
hard though. Yeah,
It takes such good care of me. Do you love
Yeah.
your body? And she's like, I love my body, but she's 4,
Yeah.
right? But
Well,
I'm
I mean,
trying.
I think the hard part is, certainly this was the case for me, but I've talked to
Yeah,
a lot of parents about this now. The hard part is real coming to terms with how little you can control.
yeah.
Even
Well,
if you
middle
do
age.
all right, even if you do all of those things, your kids are in the world
Yeah.
and they're of the world. And so I always try to I always try to go to the level of structure to give them the
Right.
tools, the concepts, the intellectual capacity to understand the structure of the things that are happening around them. So, yes, pointing out that self objectifying is unhealthy, self
Mhm.
perfecting is unhealthy. Um, but then maybe as they get older, explaining how that feeds the economy of the internet, like be media critical, because in fact they're so
Well, I just
immersed.
basically tell them that the internet is the devil. I mean, mine are 4 and 9, so I just keep
Yeah.
saying it's the devil.
Well, I mean,
Nobody has a phone. Nobody.
the technology is changing so fast
Hmm.
that who knows what it's going to look like by the time your kids are 10.
I know. I
But
can't. I
between
can't wait.
now and 10, they're still going to be exposed to so much that you personally cannot control. And so I think that imbuing kids with a sense of their own worth, with unconditional love, with that feeling that they are supported, as you described, right? That they're
Hmm.
that they have worth. And I think this is really important for boys, even more than girls in some ways, because boys' worth is so tied to transaction, the providing and the
Mm,
protecting. It's very transactional. And so a lot of young men have grown up thinking, if I do those things, I'm owed,
mm.
right? I'm
Oh,
doing
for
what
sure.
I'm supposed to do. Why
But the
aren't
world
you?
owes me.
The women owe me,
Mhm.
not just the world, but
The
women in
system, right?
particular,
And
right?
women are a resource in that system that then I
Right.
have access.
Nobody talks about girls' roles or their purpose because wink, wink, we know it's to make babies for that's really what we
Wink.
mean,
Right,
right?
right.
But I think that if we could just just get kids to have that sense of worthiness that they are good enough as they are and that their worth is not tied to their performance, their achievements. That's super hard in our society.
And I puzzle through this because the concept of resilience to me is also, aiming for perfection, I think, is the death of resilience. And so that's why I've always been saying to the kids, like, mommy doesn't like that word. That's a dirty word to mommy. Perfect is a
Yeah.
dirty word because there's no such thing. Because I don't know how you can ever be resilient if you're aiming for perfect. I don't
I mean,
know how
it's
that
hard,
works.
right? Yeah.
But is it really that much harder now for kids? You say, like, people talk about the environments becoming more competitive.
Hmm.
I was extremely competitive when I was a kid, and everyone around me was. Now, maybe that was our community, and it
Hmm.
was it was the best college or bust. It was 1600 on the SATs or
Hmm.
bust. Everything
Hmm.
was,
Yeah.
but we never had a sense that we weren't still loved. It was just the right balance of wanting to push ourselves and always believing we could have done better and we should have done
Hmm.
better, but also knowing that we were loved anyway. And this balance, I don't know. I think about it all the time. How do we teach our children to persevere, and I mean doggedly persevere,
Mm.
without ignoring their feelings? Because I was able to do that. So, I want to talk a little bit about your journey as well, because so much of this book on resilience to me read like your personal exploration of how to be kinder to yourself, right? How
I
society needs
mean,
to be kinder, but you too. And you talk about, you had a cancer scare for your husband. You're watching your dad suffer and you're not able to get to him,
right,
and do the thing that we do, which is to do the thing and be there and do the
right,
research and help the dad and buy the medicine. And he's gotten dementia. He's broken
right,
his hip. Then he's quarantined. Then there's
right,
a hurricane in your native
right.
Bahamas. And then there's the pandemic, and there's this sort of pressure to be resilient. You describe awakening, sort of to the negative impact of the lessons that you absorbed
Hmm.
through this triple, quadruple, quintuple
Right.
whammy of these things. Like, what it means between grit and stoicism and all of that to
Hmm.
really be resilient. And it almost sounds like you realize there was a pain threshold competition going on.
Well, I mean, I think I was really struck by the emptiness of what resilience meant, like
Yeah,
hearing resilience over and over again,
yeah.
because nothing about the experiences that we had during COVID, and everybody had them, like COVID intensified every other experience. It
Mm,
intensified every other tragedy. It intensified every other risk and threat, right? It made racism more harmful. It made xenophobia more intense. Like every bad thing just got concentrated, and
mm,
things were happening simultaneously. And I think it was that experience of everything collapsing in at one time that really heightened the degree to which any ability to try and be resilient as an individual by like alone was just an illusion, right?
yeah.
It was just an illusion. And maintaining that illusion was counter resilient. It actually made everything much harder. And I think, as you said, women in particular are socialized not to ask for help.
Mm.
Men too, but in a different way. And the way that men are socialized to not ask for help is to ignore the help they're getting, right?
Ignore the
That's
help.
different.
Right, right. Act
That's
like they're not getting the
different.
help that they're
That,
getting.
it's just to pretend that the help they're getting is valueless, worthless, not that consequential, not important. I think that we're having a real reckoning about that.
Mhm.
Divorces, queerness, chore wars, pick your thing.
Yeah.
But we can no longer pretend that's the case anymore, right? For women to be resilient themselves, they're saying, no, no, we're not doing this anymore. So it's a
And
real,
yeah, and
it's
in a
a
way, it's
resilience of
helping men.
refusal.
It's helping men better understand also that it's not just okay to be vulnerable; that they always were.
They
Because
always
if you
were.
admit the help you've been getting,
Right.
then you get that you've never done it alone.
No, you've never done it alone. And, I really am stuck on this word protection,
Yeah.
right? Because women protect their families every day,
Oh, for sure.
and it's not just a matter, for example, of money. We protect our families from foodborne illnesses, right? Every woman knows how not to poison her family.
And thank you for calling me out on that because you're right. My comfortable, romanticized notions of aspects of healthy masculinity probably are not necessarily serving me as much as I think they are.
Well,
My
and we're
last
doing it all the
question, though,
time. Yeah.
my last question in to be respectful of your time is for you. For you.
Hmm.
There's a point where kind of optimism and a good attitude crosses over into a delusional commitment to a specific outcome.
Hmm.
Many of those delusional commitments, look, it got me into Harvard. Like, it's not like we
Right.
don't, it gets me places,
Yeah. You have
whatever.
to visions, you have to have
But,
hopes.
but in a way, we have to keep redrawing the line between what is healthy and what is not. And so
Hmm.
for you, how do you know when you're just being stubborn, stoic, and saying, I'm not dead yet, I can do this, versus when you're actually on the healthy side of the line? How do you know when you're actually being resilient in a healthy way versus when personally you're being stubborn, stoic, and
Oh
saying, I'm just
gosh.
not dead yet. I can do this.
I don't. I don't. Like
Then where's the hope
I
for the rest of us if you don't? You
well,
wrote the book.
no. I mean, I think that what I would say vis-a-vis optimism goes back to this notion of cognitive flexibility. I really am a person who's like I'm very strategic about my pessimism. I have a lot of pessimism, but in fact, I have a lot of. My husband says to do the work I do, and he's right. To be like a feminist thinking person and an activist and an author like this, you have to have daily pessimism, but eternal optimism. You have to really believe that things can change and that they can improve and that the acts of people can lead to that improvement. But you have to acknowledge all the fuckery, all the
Mm,
badness, and
mm.
it's just a constant balance. And sometimes it's a constant imbalance, right? Sometimes I just plunge into despair. And it's then that I really think about what it means to have a network of friends that help me be resilient because I can pass the baton. I can know they're doing that work. I can rest and restore myself, recuperate, and go back. And then they can rest. It's really a partnership of ideas and work. And so that's how I would put it.
And living in that quagmire
Living with
is the
ambiguity, man,
definition.
living with ambiguity is very hard, and some people can do it better than others. Some people really can't do it,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, thank you for doing it as well as you do. And
Oh,
thank you for
thank
writing
you.
The
It was such
Resilience
a
Myth.
such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I
Mhm.
appreciate your time. I'm going to